filling up very nicely. Yes, indeed. And we may even have some people coming on a little bit later because they're not used to the total idea of a switch from 12:20 to noon. We basically start at 12:20, and on a number of occasions, we do start early at noon, but some people can't get it through their heads. But we're very well populated right now.
People are used to going to the buffet, I'm sure, right?
Exactly.
Now we have to get our own coffee, you know.
Damn.
Touche.
I can dream about what you ordinarily serve.
More sticks.
Excellent. So Simon, once we're ready to get started, just a little housekeeping here. Excuse me, I'm going to mute everybody. You might need to take yourself off of mute. Okay. Cool. The same with you, Gary.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Excellent. Shirley.
So Gary, are you in California then?
No, I'm in Ohio. My children are in, and they'll be with us tomorrow night for sure.
Gary, I think you meant to say Omaha, not Ohio.
One is in California and two are in Minneapolis, and I'm in Omaha.
That's what I thought. I'm sorry. My bad.
That's okay.
I'm in Cleveland, Simon. Sunny and 80 today.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
You're going to get our weather tomorrow, from what I understand. So
that sounds good. I heard rains on that. It looks like it was raining this morning. I heard rains in our forecast.
Cool.
That's wonderful.
So we have a brother who teaches in part-time at Harvard and used to teach part-time at Boston University. He has a private practice in organizational behavior.
So he teaches in schools of management or
yes,
technology?
Actually, ironically, public health as well, organizational behavior in public health.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I taught at BU for 10 years before coming to Northeastern, actually.
Interesting.
I made the switch.
Both of my kids went to BU.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
When?
And that's
about 30 years ago.
Yeah, a little before my time.
I know.
I'm happy here. That's all I would say. They're all good schools, but this has been a nice home for me. Really nice colleagues here.
Well, wonderful. Well, I think with that note, we'll begin as people begin to populate our presentation. And I would like to welcome everybody to a combined program with the University of Nebraska Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies and B'nai B'rith Breadbreakers. And to begin with a brief introduction, I would love to invite Jeanette Gabriel. But before Jeanette jumps on, I would just like to ask everybody to turn their cell phones off and remind them, while you will be placed on mute, I would remind you, if you happen to get a phone call, please make sure you're on mute. And then when you're done with your distraction, you can please come back and join us. And as Joel said, everybody will be on mute. Simon will talk for a while, and then when he is ready, he will open it up for questions, and then we'll unmute people. And I'll just wave your hand or use the reaction button in the lower right side of your screen, and you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. And with that, now, Jeanette Gabriel, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this special event of the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at UNO and the Breadbreakers event of the B'nai B'rith Omaha chapter. We have a special speaker in with us today who will be talking about his upcoming book this afternoon. And then tomorrow evening, joining us for the annual 2021 Sokolov Lecture. So I hope that you will all join us tomorrow evening for that event as well. And hope you have a wonderful time in the event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest presenter today. His name is Simon Rabinovitch, PhD, who teaches and writes about different aspects of Jewish, European, Russian, and legal history. A scholar, Simon is a published author and editor whose works have been recognized by a number of distinguished academic and literary organizations, such as the Historia Nova Prize Group and the National Jewish Book Group. The Northeastern University professor has studied and lectured in Russia and Finland, Israel, and Canada, to name just a few places. He earned his undergraduate degree at McGill in Montreal and received both his MA and PhD in history at Brandeis. He's currently working on a book called Religious Freedom and the Jews, Collective Rights in Modern State. And that is going to be published by Yale University Press. He compares legal cases in Europe, North America, Africa, and Israel, where civil courts have decided on matters of Jewish law and communal identity. Besides teaching at other universities, he's also had an appointment at Boston University's Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies. And one particular note of honor and distinction, he is a brand new US citizen as of a couple of months ago, and we welcome him to B'nai B'rith Breadbreakers.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the B'nai B'rith chapter, thanks to University of Nebraska, Omaha, and the Schwab Center. It's wonderful to see you, Nate Schwab, founder, and especially thanks to Jeanette Gabriel for inviting me for these wonderful events. And maybe next year in Omaha, I'm delighted that we were able to do it, even if virtually. It's wonderful to be here with you. And one of the benefits is maybe more people were able to join. So I'm going to talk to you today about the book that I'm working on, which Gary mentioned in the kind introduction, is about religious freedom and the Jews, and in particular about, I look at cases where secular or civil courts have had to decide on these matters of Jewish law or Jewish identity in different places around the world. And I'm going to give you a couple examples today. So the book explores how Jews have exercised rights as a collectivity in modern states that presumably have legal systems that operate on the principle of individual rights. I look at how legal principles of religious freedom, freedom of conscience, religious minority rights have all been used to carve out spheres of autonomy for Jews in liberal democratic states. And what I'm doing is running against something of a truism for people who studied state modernization, which is that states, as they modernized, they shifted towards governing and regulating people as individuals rather than according to their membership in groups, whether as members of estates or guilds or by religion or even by sex, right? This is one of our sort of key principles that we understand about what happens to states as they develop and they modernize. They shift towards these legal systems that treat people as individuals rather than as groups. And really the international legal emphasis on individual rather than group or minority rights as a means or a way to govern a state really accelerated in the post-World War II period with the development of international human rights law and treaties on human rights. And we can sort of understand why this would be the case, because Nazi Germany so thoroughly discredited the idea that states should categorize people legally according to groups And human rights law came to focus on rights that are guaranteed to individuals. And the world sort of adopted this formula that groups exercise their rights to national determination through states, right? And state sovereignty, that's what group rights is. But states should treat their citizens as individuals, legally, rather than as groups. And I'm not suggesting that this legal shift didn't occur, this shift from rights and disabilities for groups to individuals, that it didn't happen. But I'm arguing in this book that group rights persist in a lot of important ways, and ways that aren't properly understood. And Jews are a really interesting test case for exploring this relationship between collective and individual rights in the modern world. So as a test case, you can sort of go back to the first example where Jews gained full civil equality in Europe, which was France in 1791. And when they did, when the National Assembly granted full citizenship to all Jews, it was in tiers. First, it was the Sephardic Jews of the south of France, but when they granted full equality to all Jews as citizens, Jews had to swear an oath giving up their rights to a separate judicial system, to separate courts, and any sort of legal group autonomy. And I asked a French historian about this. You know, did they really swear these oaths? Or is it just sort of theoretical in granting citizenship? You know, it's acknowledged that they no longer have these courts and separate judicial system. And he said, no, they actually, to gain citizenship, they had to go and swear an oath. And sometimes opponents of Jewish emancipation sought to prevent them from doing so. So in this very first instance of Jews gaining civil equality, like I said, it was as a trade of collective rights for individual rights. But even so, the French government continued to regulate Jews as a group in key ways and rebuilt an infrastructure of Jewish communal governance and official religious leadership that remains to this day. And different kinds of Jewish collective rights continue to exist in many places in Europe today. So in the UK, Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary, the Russian Federation, they all subsidize an official Jewish community or a federation of Jewish communities, recognize a chief rabbi or a community president. Many more countries subsidize Jewish public schools in the way that they do other religious schools. Sweden recognizes Yiddish as an official minority language. People may not know that, as well as other, it's not the only official minority language, but it's one of the recognized minority languages. And other countries that take a tithe, such as Italy and Finland, allow for citizens paying taxes to redirect that tithe or that church tax to the Jewish community instead. And I actually have some direct experience with this. As I lived in Finland, I lived in Helsinki for a year as a visiting scholar with my family in 2011, 2012. And we moved in August. And at the beginning of September, I went to the main synagogue, which also serves as a community center and has the school, a kindergarten through high school attached, and asked about going to high holiday services. And the administrator in the office said, it's no problem. You can go. You don't have to pay for anything. Just when you get your tax form, be sure to opt out of the tithe and indicate you are a member of the Jewish community, because the community, the government subsidizes officially acknowledged religious communities, and the money that comes through taxation, through direct taxation, goes to pay for all of these things: the mikvah, the ritual bath, the school, the upkeep on the building, a nursing home they have, et cetera. So it's really important communal services. So you might say, okay, so that's Europe, right? Here in the United States, there's separation of religion and state, and this makes these sorts of subsidies and official recognition impossible. But actually, it's the US's deference to religious freedom that's made possible examples of the most comprehensive Jewish political and religious autonomy outside of Israel. So people may or may not know this, but there's a town now outside of New York City. It's somewhat not far upstate, but somewhat upstate New York, called Palm Tree. This used to be the village of Kiryas Joel. It's a 100% Satmar Hasidic town. The term palm tree is a loose translation of Teitelbaum, who was the Satmar Rebbe, who passed away. And this began as a village within the town of Monroe that was, says that you can't see.
Can't see it yet. It shows you've started sharing.
I'm going to stop it and start again because it said that I paused the share, but no. Jeanette and I said, oh, yes, for sure. This won't be any problem. Okay, let me try one more time. I'm not sure what happened there. Share. You got it?
Yes.
There
Okay.
you go. You're in.
All right. So what happened here was, to give a sort of very short version, the Satmars, who were located in Williamsburg, started to feel that modern life was creeping in a little bit too much and went looking for a community outside of the city that they could create that would be more isolated. They bought land in the 70s in the town of Monroe. They started to build completely illegally too dense housing that was outside of zoning, which led to a number of fights with the town of Monroe. And then they took advantage of a New York State statute that allows any people more than 500 living contiguously to vote to create a village that would then have control of zoning. And so they did that. They created the village of Kiryas Joel, which was a village incorporated in the town of Monroe, but that had its own mayor and had control of zoning, and was 100% Hasidic. Eventually the town wanted to expand. You can see in this map there were fights essentially because the village wanted to take more territory from Monroe in order to build more dense housing, and this led to a secession movement, which succeeded. There was a vote, it passed through Albany, and is now, I believe as of January 2019 was when it became a town. The village of Kiryas Joel became the town of Palm Tree. Now, the village of Kiryas Joel and this town of Palm Tree really exists with a complete overlap of religious and communal government under the support of the state of New York. Even when the Supreme Court ruled their separate school board unconstitutional, there was a very big fight that went to the Supreme Court because this village of Kiryas Joel created a separate public school board, and they lost. The Supreme Court decided that this school board was unconstitutional because there was an improper overlap of religious and secular governance of it, and it really was a single purpose sort of thing. Even when they lost at the Supreme Court, they used their power in Albany to have the piece of legislation that created it rewritten. This was fought and they lost. This was fought and they lost. This was fought and they lost. And on the fourth try, the opponents ran out of money. So this separate school board, which serves only students with special needs, and I can get into that and explain it more if people have questions, still exists for the town of Kiryas Joel. Here is a sign at the entrance to the village of Kiryas Joel, which instructs people coming into it, and you can see it's in English and in Spanish, because it's not directed at the residents, it's directed at people coming in to work, to keep their regulations on modesty and gender segregation within the town. Well, this is actually within the village. I want to go and take a photo and see if they've updated it for town of Palm Tree. But you'd say, how is this constitutional, right? How can a municipality have a sign about imposing gender segregation on religious basis? Well, if you look really, really closely, there's a little box at the bottom that says it's sponsored by Congregation Yetev Lev of Kiryas Joel, which is the Satmar congregation. So theoretically, it's being put up by the congregation, except in reality, if you know about the town, there is no distinction between the congregation itself and the municipal governance. They are the same. So this is sort of an example. My point being is that even if in the United States, there's not officially recognized Jewish communities in the way there might be in Finland, it has not prevented the establishment of very clear Jewish collective politics. I have another interesting example. This is a picture I took at a rest stop outside. I was actually driving from New York City to Montreal not that long ago, a few years ago. And this was at the High Peaks rest stop, which is an area frequently traveled by Hasidic Jews, both to upstate communities and also to Montreal itself. And there's this sign, right? So it says, on the left, it says, please use the water fountain for drinking purposes only. Thank you. I mean, that was clearly because they needed to provide some sort of English explanation for what this Yiddish sign is, right? But, on the Yiddish version, it says that, that there's all year round, you can't wash your hands in the sink, right? Also, there is a sink that you can wash your hands in, and it's not in the bathroom, which means that you can say a blessing for washing your hands before meals. Because if you wash your hands in the bathroom, you can't say the blessing before meals. But also, there's a sink in the sukkah, right? So, and by the way, this wasn't even during Sukkot. This was in December. So posting a sign in Yiddish, and I'm not actually sure that this was really, I think this might even been a forgery. I don't even know for sure it's from the New York State Department of Transportation rather than some Hasidic Jews who wanted to sort of make people actually listen. But you say, okay, so posting a sign in Yiddish doesn't constitute a collective right? It's not the way Sweden acknowledges Yiddish as a minority language. But you have, assuming this is the New York State Department of Transportation, you have the city providing a sink for ritual washing and a single-purpose building on its grounds for use by one religious group, right? A sukkah, for anyone who might know, is sort of a hut that's constructed in the fall or on the holiday of Sukkot, which is sort of a Jewish Thanksgiving that people are supposed to eat in. It's not required, by the way, to eat all of your meals in it, but people are supposed to eat in it, or at least once. And this is, I think, one might say, beyond accommodation, right? Beyond non-necessary accommodation, but rather catering to the religious needs of a specific group. So the examples I've just described conflict with this broader view of post-World War II Jews exercising political sovereignty in Israel collectively, and primarily as individuals within liberal democratic states in the rest of the world, especially in the United States. I can stop sharing. You can see my beautiful face again. And this is a view, of course, that Israel itself has sought to further. And the recent nation state law, which I'll talk about tomorrow, has several articles that emphasize this dichotomy between Israel as the place of Jewish collective self-determination and the rest of the world where individuals require protection by Israel. And in my own work, I found that court cases are a really interesting means of highlighting how individual and collective rights can come into conflict. Because one way you know that a collective right is there is by the fact that courts get dragged into conflicts within a community over whether an individual's personal freedom or that of a community's personal freedom or religion or self-description takes precedence. And those legal battles are really at the heart of my book. And today I'm just going to give you two examples mostly because they relate really nicely to my talk tomorrow. And both of these examples relate to the question of defining who is a Jew. And you might think to yourself, okay, well, that's not a problem that has any legal ramifications, or at least not outside of Israel. But in fact, it is in any context where group membership has specific rights or protections. But I will start with the Israeli case. And really part of this is to be able to show that a comparison can be made and that there's a lot of similarities between Israel as a Jewish state and other liberal democratic states in how they address these problems. So in Israel, Israel is still actually grappling with the fallout from a Supreme Court case in 1970 that I'm going to talk about now, which created a statutory definition for who is a Jew. Until that time, Israel didn't have a statutory definition of who a Jew is. The law of return, which guaranteed Jews the rights to migrate and make their home in Israel, didn't define what it meant by who was a Jew. And it was actually a fight over the population registry that led to what exists now, which is that someone is Jewish as defined by halakha, that is, by matrilineal descent. But for the purposes of citizenship based on the law of return, a person needs only one Jewish grandparent, and that person's spouse and their family all qualify for citizenship, regardless of whether they're Jewish. And this is a change that this is an amendment that came in the wake of a Supreme Court case that was known as the Chalite Case. So to give you a little bit about this case, you have a couple, Benjamin and Anne Chalite, who get married. Benjamin is Israeli and Jewish. Anne is not. She's from Scotland. Benjamin was doing graduate work in Scotland. They meet. They return to Israel in 1960. Excuse me. They make their home in Israel. They have a child in 1964, whose name is Oren, who's a lovely guy, actually. I've met him. And when filling out the required forms on the population registry, or the father, Benjamin, leaves blank the space for religion, and in the space for nationality writes Jew. Now, an Interior Ministry official, whoever was processing this, just rejects it. And he or she changes Oren's nationality to not registered, and then the space for nationality, in the space for religion writes father Jewish, mother alien. So they let it go. And then they have another child, Galia, in 1967. And this time they decide they're going to fight it. So they do the same thing when filling out the form for the population registry. And they write an accompanying letter to the Ministry of Interior indicating their reasons for registering their daughter that way, and explaining that this was the only acceptable way to do it. Again, with the space blank for religion and Jewish in nationality. And what happens is the Interior Ministry once again ignores their wishes, but this time registers not registered in the space for nationality, and father Jewish, mother alien in the space for religion. Now, people probably did not catch that. Oops. But it's actually the opposite of what they did for the first child. So if you can see my pointer here, when Oren was born, here for religion, it says father Jewish, mother alien. And for nationality, the it says lo rishum, not registered, right? Galia is born, right? And they do the reverse. For religion, not registered. For nationality, father Jewish, mother alien. So the point is, clearly the Ministry of Interior didn't want to register either of these children as Jewish by nationality, but even these terms were ambiguous enough that they themselves did not know the difference or didn't know how to treat them differently and were confused about what they should write, because they actually reverse the part about whether to put that the mother is Jewish, the mother was an alien and the father was Jewish. In one case, they put it in religion, and the other case they put it in nationality. In any event, the Chalites took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the resulting case was an enormously big deal, with supporters for Chalite arguing for the case's significance for freedom of religion, separation of religion and state, and the secular identity of the state itself. Opponents of Chalite, on the other hand, argued that he was seeking nothing less than the destruction of the Jewish people. And the president of the Supreme Court at the time, Shimon Agranat, tried to push the government to just eliminate the category for nationality from the population registry so they didn't have to hear the case, right? He said, there's an easy, they didn't want to hear this case. They didn't want to touch it. And they said, there's an easy answer here. Just take out nationality, right? And write down what people's religion is, what they want. The government said, nope, they were not going to legislate on it. You have to decide. So what Agranat did was he appointed a full court of justices to hear the case. Now, in Israel, it doesn't work the way it does here, where the whole Supreme Court hears every case. It's a system similar to many places in Europe, where there's a president of the Supreme Court who determines how many people and who should hear which case. And not everybody hears every case this way. As long as it's an odd number, they can hear more cases. So at that time, there were 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And this was the first time in Israel's history that the president had appointed all 9 justices to hear the case. He felt that if they were going to do it, the full court should hear it. Again, both sides argued for the tremendous consequence of this case. But my question is, was it really so consequential? I mean, it was highly symbolic, but in practical effects, it had no meaning, right? So this was just a population registry and for birth certificates and for keeping the demographics of the track of the demographics of the state. But, you know, for the Chalite children, they were Israeli citizens no matter what. They could vote when they became age and serve in the military and become members of Knesset. They were Israeli citizens. From a religious purpose, you know, as long as there was an Orthodox rabbinate, a state Orthodox rabbinate, they weren't going to be considered Jewish and they wouldn't be able to marry as Jews. The population registry changes none of those facts at all. And so it is completely symbolic. Of course, anytime I've talked about these cases in Israel, and I've given a couple of papers at seminars at the law school in Tel Aviv, I'm accused of being a legal formalist. That how can you say it's not consequential? Look at all of the precedent that it might cause, and it might create new legal arguments for getting rid of the rabbinate, etc. I'm not convinced. I don't see the necessary trickle down effect here, but certainly from a symbolic perspective, people living in Israel felt that this was the high court determining whether the product of an intermarried family where the mother was not Jewish should be considered Jewish as by nationality. In the end, the Supreme Court decided in Chalite's favor in a narrow 5-4 victory. The majority opinion determined that ministry officials violated Chalite's individual freedom of conscience, and on the other side, the minority in dissent argued that the state should not commit national suicide. But this decision sent the government into crisis because it was, of course, a coalition, if anybody's following Israeli politics now. And at the time, the Interior Ministry was held by the National Religious Party. And it wasn't clear that who was responsible for the population registry. And it wasn't clear that they were going to implement the directive of the court, which would have created an even bigger constitutional crisis. So a compromise was reached, which is what exists now, that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that they would create for the first time a statutory legal definition of who is a Jew. And they did that according to halakha and according to matrilineal descent. Essentially, if your mother is a Jew. They did add an additional part, which is that, and those who have not converted to another religion. But that is the legal definition of who is a Jew in Israel. But the socialist or socialist-leaning labor coalition party members in the government did not want to do anything that would exclude migration to the state from anybody who self-identified as a Jew. And so that's why at the same time, they expanded the law of return to include anybody with a Jewish grandparent and their relatives, essentially. And actually, I have an article in December from Haaretz where I talk about the unintended demographic consequences of this decision, which nobody really could have predicted at the time because it was 1970 and the Soviet Union didn't seem like it was going anywhere. Okay, well, as I mentioned before, Israel isn't the only place where what and who is a Jew has legal significance. In much of Europe, governments recognize and subsidize official Jewish communities. And so determining membership and who gets to play gatekeeper has real consequences. So a couple of small examples, in Spain and Portugal, which have instituted rights of return for Sephardi Jews, right? How that is defined has legal consequences for citizenship, as did Germany give preferred immigration status for Jews from the Soviet Union, although that has ended, as did the United States. But I'm going to discuss briefly the United Kingdom and a case about Jewish identity and membership that went to the Supreme Court there. So this starts with the Jews Free School in London. Which is this building, which was established in 1732 as a charitable school and was funded through the 19th century by the patronage of wealthy Anglo-Jews such as the Rothschilds, the Goldsmiths, the Montefiores. But today, like Anglican, Catholic, and Muslim schools in the United Kingdom, the JFS receives state funding to operate essentially as a public school or a publicly funded private school. Maybe we would call it semi-private. Now, what the deal is in return is that any of these religious schools accepting funds from the state have to take applicants or consider applicants who are not of that religion. Now, there is an exception to that rule, and that is if the school is oversubscribed, if there's more applicants than there are spots. So there are a number of Jewish schools throughout the UK that have lots of students who aren't Jewish, and are essentially public schools in smaller cities, not small cities, but in Manchester, Liverpool, et cetera, that have historic Jewish schools that now accept non-Jewish students. But the JFS is in the very large, right in the middle of the large Jewish community in London. And it is a very good school that people want their kids to go to. And so it is always oversubscribed. It has had the privilege of being able to always determine its own admission criteria and only accept Jewish students according to its own definition. So it's never had to worry about this. And the way the Chalite case divided Israel in 1970, what came to be known as the JFS case, divided Anglo Jewry in the late 2000s. And the case centered around a father whose child was denied admission to the school on the basis that he was not recognized as Jewish. The child was not recognized as Jewish because the mother, who had converted before the child was born, did so in a non-Orthodox denomination. She did a Masorti conversion, which is sort of like a conservative conversion here. It wasn't Orthodox. And so you actually have to fill these sort of questions out on the application. And the child was disqualified from applying for not being Jewish. So the boy's father filed suit arguing that the school had discriminated against his son based on who his mother was and based on ethnic descent, because he argued the mother had been Jewish. The school was supported by the government in this fight, and it was officially represented by the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, essentially the official Jewish community, which organizes and runs the school. And they said, well, we define who is Jewish by halakha, meaning matrilineality. And since we don't recognize non-Orthodox conversions, the mother was not Jewish when the child was born, and so the child is not Jewish. So once again, you have a father who's arguing that the state has an obligation not to endorse a particular definition of communal membership. And specifically that in doing so, they're saying by supporting the school, right, through taxes, it was discriminating. And what's more, again, on the other side, you have the state, and the state supported the school in the case, arguing that they have to uphold the obligations of the collective to determine its own membership. And in the JFS case, both sides argue their positions from the standpoint of religious freedom. I'd also add that, like the Chalite case, the JFS case was highly symbolic, and the effects ended up being practical. But for this father who was sort of launching this legal war, it really wasn't relevant. I mean, you can't, when you have to find a kid to somewhere to go to school, you can't wait for a decision to wind its way through courts, obviously, right? The kid was signed up at another school. There was no intention of switching the kid back. In fact, the father and the mother had been divorced, and she did not in any way support this battle that he was on, but he felt it was very important to gain this acknowledgement that his son had been discriminated against. So the father initially loses his racial discrimination case. It goes to appeal. He wins that appeal. And the school and the official community and the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth appealed to the Supreme Court. And the case goes up to the British Supreme Court. Now, neither the Supreme Courts in Israel or in the UK had any desire to be dragged into these disputes, which necessitated weighing into the question of how Jews define communal membership. And they tried to avoid it, tried to make decisions based on narrow technical grounds. They scream, the majority justices scream, we are not interfering in the question of who is a Jew. But of course they were. There was really no way to avoid it.
Simon, if
yeah.
I may interrupt for just a second,
Sure.
I'm hoping that in a couple of minutes that you will be able to take some questions as we near the 1 o'clock deadline, but
no problem at all.
And we're willing to go way past the deadline if other
no problem at all. I
understand.
can sum it up in 2 minutes.
Great.
And then we can take questions. So, I mean, I hope that people can see the similarities in these cases, right? Even though the Jews are a minority in the UK and a majority in Israel, the courts face the same problem, right? In both places, being Jewish is widely understood as being part of a shared culture and history that includes but is not solely defined by religion. But admission to the group and membership is mediated by a state acknowledged religious authority, as both Israel and the UK grant a monopoly to on official religion to the Orthodox. And in fact, when you read the language of the decision, the British judges are far more deferential in their language to the idea that the meaning of who is a Jew is something unchanging and based on religion, and the Orthodox should be able to decide that, than Israeli judges who said, had a lot of problem with the idea that these kids being raised in Israel to secular parents who identify as being Jewish shouldn't be considered Jewish, right? So those are the cases. And just to sum up what I'm trying to do, in this book is, on the one hand, to point out that collective rights are still around, and Israel has recently baked in some of these collective rights of the majority into their constitutional documents, which we'll talk about tomorrow. And also to modify this view that Israel is the sole expression of Jewish collective rights, and that in the diaspora, it's really individual rights only. And to say the distance isn't maybe as far as we think. And so I'll sum up there, but I will leave us, I'll end there, but I will leave us maybe with one final image to go back to Kiryas Joel. Oops. And their Twitter page, the Satmar Twitter page, where all the good stuff is on Twitter, the fun stuff is on Twitter. And there was a tweet a little while ago from Kiryas Joel, I guess it was a year or two ago, that talked about immigration, right? Close to 100 new Satmar families have immigrated from New York City to Kiryas Joel. So maybe even this idea of sovereignty being split collectively between Israel and the diaspora is not as clear cut as we think. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. If you have a question, you can either wave your hand or hit the reaction button in the lower part of your screen. So let's open it up for questions. Not everybody at once.
I experienced this in teaching too. Nobody wants to go first, and then
everybody goes. So I guess I'll start it out, because one of the things that fascinated me is the depth that you could actually go into in studying this kind of question. So what made you decide on the question? And after that, I've got Ken, Stan, and Steve Reiches. So Simon, what made you get involved with this? This is fascinating.
So that's a great question. So it actually goes back to Helsinki. So I did my dissertation about a Jewish political movement and a political idea in late imperial and revolutionary Russia, called autonomism. And this was an idea that was formulated by a Jewish historian and political theorist named Shimon Dubnov, which basically said that, in the Russian Empire, as everybody's developing all of these national movements, these minorities around them are developing national movements and making claims to territory. The Jews have to do this also. But our nationalism doesn't need to be territorial. We can have Jewish self-government and universities and language rights and all sorts of things non-territorially within the Russian Empire. And so that's what I wrote my dissertation about. And I lived in Russia to work on it and work in the archives. And then we had a couple of kids and I got the job at BU, and I need to go back and finish it. And Helsinki was a rather more family-friendly place to do the work. And it was really that experience. And of course, I'm at the time searching around for the next project because I was really just editing and finishing this up. And I'm searching around for the next project. And it was really this experience in Helsinki where Helsinki was part of the Russian Empire, right? And, here I am in the 21st century, right? And in this sort of former outpost of the Russian Empire, and this little community has achieved all of the dreams of these autonomists, direct taxation and subsidy for the government and official recognition, to have their own schools and this is all they wanted. And then it was one of those things, the phenomenon where once you notice something, you notice it everywhere, right? You're looking for a car and then suddenly that car is everywhere on the So that's what it was. I started to see it everywhere. And that's why I decided to do the next book about it.
Well, great. All right, Ken, go ahead. Short questions, please, so we can get more people in.
Okay. My father is Jewish, was Jewish, passed on. My mother was not, and converted by reform in the United States in the 1930s. So, am I technically a Jew in Israel? I'm still grappling with that. I know I can make Aliyah, but am I technically a Jew? I'm long time married to a Jew. Are my children considered Jewish? Okay, that is my question.
So the answer is, as you point out, from a legal perspective, you are absolutely entitled to citizenship and to make Aliyah. Now, from a cultural perspective, I also think most people in Israel would consider you a Jew and your children Jewish. But as long as the Orthodox rabbinate, there is an official state rabbinate that is controlled by the Orthodox, let's say if you were to get remarried or your children were to get remarried, they wouldn't marry you. You'd have to go to Cyprus. They would not acknowledge you as Jewish.
All right. That's what I figured, but I thought I'd ask that question.
But I would also resist the idea that the rabbinate may define who they get to marry, and the state may have a statutory definition of who is a Jew. But I would resist the idea that let's say culturally, that's the way it's understood in Israel. And that's certainly been the case when you look at the Soviet migration. There are many people who the rabbinate does not consider Jewish, who consider themselves Jewish and the society considers Jewish.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, Stan, then Steve Rikus.
Just had a quick question. Do you know, was the lawyer in the Chalite case, was representing him, was that Uri Regev? Do you know Uri Regev?
I don't think it was. So I do have the name of the lawyer written down. I don't think that's who it was.
Okay, so I know he was active in the civil rights, that kind of stuff back in the 70s, 80s.
The lawyer who represented him is still alive and living in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And I'm trying to remember the name. I can't remember. I actually went to Sweden and met with, Oren and the wife Anne now live in Sweden, and I went to Stockholm and met with them, and that's how I got the birth certificates. They gave me the birth certificates.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
Okay, Steve, go ahead.
Right, you did an excellent job, and I'm very familiar with the British case. But so that everybody will not think this is too abstract a subject, this subject is important to the Jews of Omaha, Nebraska. How? When the new JCC was opened in the early 70s, the Jews for Jesus were very, very active. And they thought that they should have the same status as a Jewish organization as B'nai B'rith, Hadassah, and the other Jewish organizations, vis-a-vis utilizing the JCC. The Federation figured a way out of that so that they wouldn't be sued by the Jews for Jesus by saying that the Jewish Federation of Omaha is a nonprofit Nebraska corporation, and we have the right to define our own membership, and we hereby define that the Jews for Jesus aren't Jews. So that brings the matter home to Omaha, Nebraska.
Very much so. Thank you so much for that. That's really a wonderful example, the continued ramifications of these, how one makes these definitions.
Right. I mean, Jews for Jesus love to litigate stuff like that.
That's
and we found a way to cut them short.
Any other questions? All right, very good. With that, Simon, I thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm looking forward to tomorrow night's program. Jeanette, could you just mention to people how they could connect for tomorrow night's program via Zoom?
I will send out an email to everybody who's on this program right now with a reminder registration for tomorrow night. And we will send out a few follow-ups from Dr. Rabinowich's talk today to all of you as well.
Great. I would like to mention that Beth Gershovich was on the call. I don't know if she still is. The late wife of Moshe Gershovich, who was one of the leaders, predecessor to Jeanette, the director of the Schwab Center, the late Moshe Gershovich. Thank you for joining us, Beth. And just as a reminder, next week, very, very timely topic with extremism in the news. We have the director of the Clarion Project, who is a frequent consultant to federal agencies. He'll talk about extremism, left, right, and Islamic. And I think you'll find that fascinating. And again, please, if you have any questions, send them to B'nai B'rith Omaha at gmail.com. Thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow night. And again, Simon, thank you so much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
You too. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you both very much. Thanks to all of you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Simon. It was fascinating. Really looking forward to tomorrow night.
Yeah, me too. Thanks.
So, Jeanette, I need to call you. I'll call you in a few moments.
Sounds very good. Thank you, Gary.
Okay, Maxine, thank you for joining us. Okay. Usually we have more people showing their faces. I often wonder why people stop the video all the time in doing this.
Howard Epstein had a really interesting question.
I was just going to say, go ahead, Jeanette.
Yeah, it was a very interesting question about the community in Joel, you know, and it would be, I think I'll follow up with Simon about that because he's going to primarily talk about Israel, but we are going to do a UNO TV program. And I think it would be more interesting to go into some depth about this community in upstate New York and how the New York legal structure is addressing this. You know,
yeah,
it might be very interesting. It might even be worth a follow-up program.
Very much so. Hi, Michael Parso. Good to see you.
Hello.
Okay, Joel. Oh, Steve, go ahead.
I was going to say there at a Klutznick symposium, a paper was presented on the British Supreme Court decision in the case that you mentioned. And one of the things is that could something like that happen here? And I, as an American lawyer, said no. I don't think that something like that could happen because religious communities can have the right to define from themselves who is a member and who isn't. The problem with the British court system was that you had 9 Gentile lords of the House of Lords deciding who was a Jew and who wasn't a Jew.
Interesting. Joel, I think we're about ready. If we could end this meeting.
We will wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Take care.
Hi,
Have a
Janelle.
great day.
Hi, Michael. Good to see you.
Hi, Janelle.
Jeanette, Michael Parso says hello.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good. So Miss Janelle, I got all questions. So I am the representative at Camp Saba this summer, which has my offer upon me yet. So Jeanette, so people asking where South School Internet is. So Saba isn't really quote busy this summer at Saba. I'm looking there, and we're not short on people. We're not sure people hiring this summer at Saba, and wondering if we to find out as an office manager for Sabra, really bad.
So wait, you're recruiting for Camp Sabra. You need an office manager?
We do.
Well,
badly.
if Jeanette or anybody knows about someone who's free for the summer.
Let me know.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Michael, I'll follow up with you on that. I'll send you an email, okay?
All right, and of course, send me a link to me so I can Zoom you.
Sounds good. All right, take care, everyone.
Okay.
Good job. Good job, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks very
We
much.
could end it, Jeanette. Thank you.
Thank you.